Hello, and welcome to our program, Where God Weeps. On September 9, 1990, Father Alexander Menn was killed by the blow of an axe. Father Alexander was a simple Russian Orthodox priest. He served in a small parish, and yet for over 30 years, hundreds of thousands of faithful came to listen to his teachings and read his writings. Father Alexander's books have subsequently been translated into over 20 languages, and millions of copies have been distributed worldwide. Among his spiritual followers are counted Solzhenitsyn, Rostropovich, and he is even honored within the Catholic world by such figures as Pope John Paul II. Who was this extraordinary man, and how is it possible that a simple Russian Orthodox priest was able to have such an impact around the world? Let's watch now the story of Father Alexander Menn.
Father Alexander Menn was born in 1935. He was baptized as a child, together with his mother, Elena Menn. She, as well as her husband, belonged to the Moscow Jewish intelligentsia. But in contrast to her husband and relatives, she was completely converted to Christianity. She was baptized together with her son, but for her it was the result of about 2 years of preparation, Bible reading, praying, and it became possible due to the influence of her sister, baptized some time earlier, Vera Vasilevskaya. They were baptized in the so-called Catacomb Church, after the declaration of the Metropolitan Sergei, which said that in the Soviet Union there were no martyrs, but only the political opponents of the new system. And after the Church, in spite of the persecution and concentration camps and victimization, declared itself completely loyal to the state power. Your joy is our joy. The major part of the clergy went underground, partly because they didn't agree with such a position, partly just to save themselves from the real persecution. God-fearing women believers hid them in their houses, and they celebrated liturgies on Christmas, Easter, etc., in the conditions of poor little houses, in rooms where they could be traced and arrested any moment. It actually happened later. And in such circumstances, very strained, but at the same time with burning spirit, as it always happens at the time of persecution, because the Christians who remain faithful really bear the fire of faith, the fire of the Holy Spirit in them. In these conditions, little Alec was growing up, so he was in-churched from the beginning. And the wonderful starets, Father Seraphim Bachugov, who was watching him, a 5-year-old boy playing near him, said, "Time will pass, and this Alec will bring many people to Christ."
He was brought up by outstanding people, the Christians who were hiding in the Catacomb Church. They cherished him since his childhood. He was brought up in the great Christian tradition. The fact that Russia had such a person and lost him so terribly doesn't cause any joyful hopes. It's a shame for our motherland that we failed to save him. It's a shame for me that I wasn't in Moscow and didn't die instead of him. He remains a great person, if only they don't turn him into a sugary icon. And this tendency is now being widely expressed, as he is of no danger to anyone now. You see, everyone was the cause of this disaster, and everyone has to redeem it. And the best thing to do in memory of Father Alexander would be to live our Christianity, to follow Christ, and consequently to follow Father Alexander.
Father Alexander Menn wasn't a part of the Soviet ideological structure. He lived on his own, but at the same time, he was always open to everything real, human, true, which is always there in any society, even a totalitarian one. Father Alexander Menn was different from many priests who went through pioneer and Komsomol organizations, and only after graduating from the atheistic philosophy faculties, suddenly went through an inner crisis, turned to faith, became Christians, started to serve, to write books, started to criticize everybody who wasn't an Orthodox believer, or who wasn't the type of Orthodox that they considered to be the right one. The way of Father Alexander Menn was absolutely different. Just as he was to finish the institute, Father Alexander was excluded from it for failing the exam on philosophy. By that time, everybody in the institute already knew about his religious ideas. The institute by that time had moved to Irkutsk, and in that little town, it was difficult to hide your preferences. But Father Alexander Menn didn't even try to. If in the beginning of his studies he didn't declare to his fellow students that he was a Christian, an Orthodox believer, by the end of the 5th year, he gradually acquainted them, as he used to say, by homeopathic doses. So by the end of the 5th year, everybody knew that he was not only a believer, but also helped in divine services, worked as a stoker in the church, wrote some articles, some works. In a word, it was well known in the institute. The chair of philosophy was up in arms against him, which was very natural, as there was only Marxist-Leninist philosophy at that time. So at the exam, he didn't get a positive mark. In fact, he was allowed to go wherever he wanted. And the Metropolitan of Mazhaisk-Makary ordained him deacon, following the recommendation of the then famous Moscow priest, Father Nikolai Goriachkin. The ordination took place at the church in Donskaya Street, Moscow. And from 1958, Father Alexander began to serve, first as deacon, and since 1960 as a priest, till 1990. For 32 years, 2 years as a deacon, 30 years as a priest. In one of his talks with school children, asked what the meaning of life is, he answered, "For me, the meaning of life is to do something for Christ every day of my life."
To grow up in the family of a priest at that time, at the time when atheism was one of the state ideologies, was rather difficult, and in some ways we felt ourselves personas non grata. But as we knew our parents very closely, we of course always had a very serious feeling of pride. I remember one case when my father and I were going by train to the south. It happened that my mother and my elder sister had gone earlier. We used to spend our vacations in Koktebel in the Crimea. And my father and I were going a little later. And after dinner, in our compartment, I climbed up on the upper berth, and my father was sitting underneath. In front of him, a man was sitting who had an intelligent appearance, a scientific appearance, let's say. It was clear that the man was engaged in science. There's such a type of person who can be easily recognized. And they began a calm, quiet conversation. The train, no hurry. And this man was astonished by Father's erudition. They were talking about biology, were philosophizing, of course. We must take into consideration that it was the end of the 60s, the beginning of the 70s, something like that. And certainly, the man couldn't even suppose that he was speaking with an Orthodox priest, as the propaganda of that time stated that priests were uneducated, badly mannered people. Father was wearing a rather shortly cut beard and could be easily taken for a scientist. And the young man, being astonished by my father's knowledge, started to ask him, "What are you? Are you a biologist?" Father said, "Yes, in a way." He asked, "Are you a physicist?" Father said, "Yes, a little. The work I do requires one to be educated in almost all spheres, to know different sciences." "Maybe you're a writer," Father answered. "Yeah, you could say so." It was an interesting talk, but the young man didn't leave him alone. He wanted to figure out what was the occupation of the man who won his heart with his erudition. And Father said, "I'm a priest of the Russian Orthodox Church." The man was shocked, just shocked. He lay down, turned away to the wall, and was lying without saying a word for a few minutes, trying to comprehend something. Then he turned to Father again, and in a low voice now began to speak and speak. And Father was answering him. I couldn't hear the talk because it was rather quiet, but I understood that it was already very different, more frank. And that feeling of pride for my father that I had at that moment has never left me all my life, both during the period of life that I lived with my father in his earthly life, and these 10 years that we have been living without him in the earthly aspect of it.
А в конце этот агнец
And at
говорит,
the end,
обращаясь
this
к людям,
lamb says, addressing people,
«Я стою
"Listen, I am
у двери
standing
и
at the door
стучу.
knocking.
И
If you
тот,
hear my
кто откроет
voice
мне,
and open
я
the
приду
door,
к тому».
I will come
и
into
буду с ним
you
вечерять.
and eat with you, and you with me."
Вот это исключительно важный
It
момент.
is an
Это, быть
extremely
может,
important moment.
кульминация
It is probably
апокалипсиса.
the culmination of
Потому
apocalypse,
что, в конце концов,
because man lives
человек
in vanity
живет
and bustle,
среди суеты,
lives seeking
живет в
illusory
погоне
values.
за иллюзорными
He does
часто
not have
целями.
time to stop
У него
and
нету
think
времени
about the main
остановиться и
thing,
подумать о
about
главном,
his
о
soul
душе,
and
о
eternity.
вечном. И вот
Then
тогда
one day
вечность сама
eternity knocks
стучится
at his
к нему,
door.
и ему
It
нужно
is necessary to
открыть
open
свое
your
сердце.
heart. And
И
then
тогда он говорит,
Jesus
я войду
says,
к нему.
I
И
will
тогда
come into
сразу
you.
меняются
And
все
immediately
параметры
life
жизни.
changes
Она
entirely.
становится
Life then
наполненной
becomes full
вечным
of eternal
смыслом.
meaning.
Today we have the pleasure to welcome to our studio Mr. Nikolai Goriachkin, film director who has recently completed the film The Way to the Church, the life of Father Alexander Men. Mr. Goriachkin has spent many years researching the life of Father Men and the followers, the spiritual sons and daughters of Father Men. Nick, welcome to our studio. Thank you for being with us and speaking today about Father Men.
Thank you. It's the very serious topic, what we're going to discuss today.
Father Alexander Men's funeral was September 11th, which is the feast day in Russia of the death of St. John the Baptist. What is the relationship and significance of the fact of these two special dates?
Well, we consider that is not a coincidence, it's very symbolical, because both of them, they were precursors. Father Man, he was precursors of returning Russia to the faith. He came in very hard period of our history. He became the priest in the middle of 60th. It's not well known, but this time, this middle of the 60th, it was the hardest time for Russian Church in the 20th century. 20th and 60th. It was a Khrushchev time. And so the well known that the time of Stalin's time, it was very hard for the church. It was the persecution for the church. But in reality, the 60th was even more cruel to the church. Father Man came in the middle of 60th. And he was the first at the beginning of 90th, or maybe even in the middle of 80th, who applied to Russian nation, who applied to the Russian state to go back to the church. And he was a precursor, and he sacrificed his life for this appeal, and Russia accepted.
Father Alexander Men was born in 1935, which was at the height of Stalin's attempt to try and eradicate Christianity in Russia. How did this influence his life and his vocation?
In those times, the church was already hidden. The church came to catacombs. And for those people who decided to devote their life to God, to faith, to mission, they understood already that it's, well, they have to be in catacombs church, they have to be hidden. They could not do their work in official way. So Father Man was educated by outstanding people from catacombs church, outstanding nuns. And he knew about his vocation from the childhood. It's interesting detail. But when he was 4 years old, he was passing by the small wooden old church. And this child, this young, small boy, he said, when I'll be an adult, I would like to be the priest, Orthodox priest in this church. So his heritage was, the faith was his heritage. It was in his blood. And it was thrown up by people from, faithful people from Catacomb Church.
Bishop Seraphim in the United States, his work went so far that Bishop Seraphim in the United States said, one cannot understand Christianity today without understanding the life and work of Father Alexander Men. Would you agree with this kind of statement about the importance of Father Men's work for the Universal Church?
Personally, I agree. I completely agree. And I guess not only me. But to say clear, there's not everybody recognize his outstanding role of Father Man in the Russian history, not only in Russian history. We cannot understand the problems, spiritual problems, historical problems of Russia without understanding life and fate of Father Alexander Men. His mission, his service, and his tragedy, it's very typical for Russia. Russia always persecuted people and sometimes kills people who is trying to save her. So Father Man, it's one of the, he's the near martyr. He's not recognized as a martyr by Orthodox Church, but people recognize him. And his life is very typical for Russia, with all her mistakes, tragedies, misunderstandings, and traumatic life.
Father Men was very close to the Catholic Church in many regards. That is, he had a great love for many Catholic saints. He had, for example, read a lot of the works of Saint Therese of Avila. He had read the works of and followed very closely Saint Maximilian Kolbe. What was it that he found attractive within the Catholic Church?
I think Father Mann recognized the universal church as Catholic Church and as the church sister of Orthodox Church. For him, church hasn't been divided for 1,000 years. He thinks about what unites the churches. He thought about common values of the church. And can you imagine that in 1960s, 70s, in his personal, I can't say the chapel, but in his small wooden house, it was the chapel, I mean the iconostas, up to his table, and there were many icons. In the equal level, it was Orthodox icons and Catholic saints all together. It wasn't divided. Two histories, two churches. It wasn't divided. And so he recognized by Catholic Church, maybe even more than Orthodox. And I think, and I hope, he was and he is and he will be the priest of the future. His faith, his sacrifice, and I can say his crucifix will unite both churches. It will be one of the bricks what will unite both churches.
Father Alexander Menn was a man ahead of his time, and as you have mentioned, he perhaps brought tragedy to himself through his thoughts, through his writings, through his expressions. Why was he killed and who was he threatening?
Let's remind first how he was killed. He was killed by the axe. What for Russia, it's a very symbolic thing, the axe. It's the symbol of Russian horror. The second symbolical meaning is the very ancient weapon. Ancient martyrs have been killed by stones, arrows, or axes. So, who killed him? After the murder, it was three basic versions. It's the KGB. Second version, it's conservative, extreme conservative wings of Orthodox Church. The third version is the extreme conservative wing of Judaism, or Jewish people. He was a Jew. So, but the investigation was cancelled 4 years ago. For 10 years it was investigation without any results. Until now nobody knows exactly in official way who killed him, but we know why he was killed. Because he followed to Christ. And Christ said, be ready, if you follow me, be ready to be persecuted, to be murdered. Because your life will come afterwards.
Which leads us to the point that in this case, we see a religious revival actually occurring in Russia. And can we use this expression, can we say in regard to Father Menn, that the blood of the martyrs are the seeds of faith, that we see this revival as a consequence of his martyrdom?
Mark, you know Russia quite well, and you know Russian tradition to build the churches where the blood was spilled. So we have one of our beautiful churches, it even calls us a church in the blood, our Christ Savior in the blood. So, and there is a small chapel now on the place where the blood of Father Alexander Menn was spilled. So it, let's say, the symbol of that. And the second symbol, his parish, small parish, 70 kilometers far away from, a little bit far away from Moscow. It's not easy to reach this parish. It's one of the biggest parish in Russia. Millions of people from all over in the world go there. It's the second symbol of how he sees it grows up. And the third symbol, we can't count how many people, how many thousand or million people came to the faith thanks to his life, thanks to his book. but we know at least that there's several million people.
Nick, you chose to make a film about the life of Father Men, which means that he must have had some impact on your life. What was it why did you choose to make a story about Father Men?
I'm from St. Petersburg. I never seen Father Man alive. For me, in those times, it was complicated to go to, but I have heard about him. But I can say about miracles what happened with me when we started to make this film. And I consider this idea to make this film as the gift from there. I was blessed to do this film. And many miracles happened. Miracles happened one after another in the process of filming and the process of editing this film. It was the kind of communication with the heaven. So I can say how it could happen, but I can say that I was completely happy to do that. And through Father Man, through his books, through his faith, through his face, I understood, well, I can say about my next conversion, what happened with me. Thanks to him, I opened the Orthodox faith, I opened the Christianity much more deeply than it was before.
Nick, thank you for having been with us today. Thank you for having shared your experiences, your knowledge of Father Alexander Men. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having been with us today in our program. If you'd like to know more information about Father Alexander Men, his life, his story, I would ask that you consider the information presented at the end of this production. And I look forward to seeing you next time on our program, Where God Weeps.